for this afternoon. We will start in a few moments as people or participants slowly trickle into the session webinar. So before we start, I would like to take a photo op of everyone for our documentation. So if everyone can please turn on their video and kindly keep your microphone muted so we can take a photograph of everyone. All right. Okay. So if everyone can please turn on their video for a while. Okay. Okay, thank you. Mo, can you tell us when? Okay, one more time. All right, thank you very much. Okay. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ronnie. I'm from the head of the Sub-Regional Office for Southeast Asia of ESCAP. I will be co-hosting this session with my colleague, Sojung Lee, and we will be trying to go through a number of topics, particularly as it relates to the survey 2021 that was launched early last month. So for some of you who are not familiar with the Survey 2021, it is a flagship publication of ESCAP, and it has been produced since 1947. And the document itself has been a valuable companion to policymakers, officials, CSOs, as well as other in academia. So for this particular report, not only is it produced by ESCAP, but it is also in partnership with experts and professionals in the relevant fields. So not only is this produced with the experts, but there's also an opportunity to discuss the document or the draft with various institutions to also get their feedback into the report. So for this 2021 report, as you may know, the focus obviously is on the COVID pandemic. This is the first year, 2020 was perhaps the first year where the COVID pandemic has still continued to have an impact in the world, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. So the focus of this survey 2021 again looks at the COVID impact, the responses of governments as well as other stakeholders and partners, and also looks into the policy recommendations and initiatives from the governments in the region. So you can imagine that in 2020 there is perhaps a lot of information, many data that can be compiled, and particularly information of the shared experiences among the governments to see how they can better coordinate in addressing the impacts of the COVID pandemic. So the report, which is prepared by the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division of ESCAP, has looked into the issues, the challenges, and have come up with a number of recommendations that governments in the Asia Pacific region, as well as outside the region, can look into. The report itself was launched by our executive secretary on the 30th of March, and it was presented by ESCAP. So for this particular session, we will have our colleague from ESCAP who will be making that presentation. So the program we have for this afternoon, if I may briefly go through, is we will have Dr. Suvojit Banerjee from the ESCAP present the report in its entirety, and then perhaps highlight some of the developments in Southeast Asia, because this is indeed a Southeast Asia dialogue. And following that, we will have a number of speakers or presenters from within the region, or at least who will take a much closer perspective on Southeast Asia's experience. We have invited, for example, Ms. Diandra Pratami from the UN Indonesia office, where she will give an overview of some of the responses the government has with respect to the COVID pandemic. Then we also look into the Mekong region by inviting Suryan, who is the executive director from the Mekong Institute, to also look into this various insights into this big sub-region of Southeast Asia. And lastly, we have a speaker from the OECD, Dr. Kensuke, who will also provide an overview of some of the responses or at least some of the recommendations that will look into Southeast Asia. Followed by that, my colleague Sojung will moderate the question and answer session. And of course, when we say question and answer, it is interactive. We also hope that speakers can also, if they have any questions, can field it to the other speakers. So with that, let us begin our program. Again, the program is to see how the recommendations from the survey are relevant to the Southeast Asia region, which of the priorities needs to be enhanced by the governments and countries, and also, most importantly, for ESCAP is what sort of partnerships can we develop from this webinar? Because I think when we look at questions, when we try to meet with some of the participants who have questions, we would also like to see if there are any common initiatives or areas of mutual interest that we can develop. So without much further ado, I would like to present our first speaker, Dr. Sujovit Banerjee. He is the Economic Affairs Officer from the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division of ESCAP. Just a bit about the background of Dr. Banerjee. He previously worked as a program manager on foreign direct investment at UNCTAD in Switzerland, and also as a policy advisor on economic reform issues at UNDP in Indonesia, as well as an investment banker at Morgan Stanley in London. So with that, may I give the floor to Dr. Suvojit, please?
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Let me try to share my screen. Is that all right?
Yes, very good.
Okay. So yes, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think you've gone through some of the basic points about the Economic and Social Survey anyway. As you pointed out, it is the longest running publication of ESCAP to cover the whole region in economic issues since 1947. And obviously this year, I mean, the concentration is on COVID-19, but we've tried to view it in a slightly more longer term view, trying to learn about what this pandemic teaches us about crises in general. So the structure of this presentation is like the publication itself. We'll first look at the outlook for the region coming out of COVID, but then try to look back at the past and as well understand the issue of crises and how to build resilience to crises of all types. And then moving forward, looking at a future view would be to look at, as countries try to design the recovery packages coming out of the crisis, how they can try to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which indeed means that they would be preparing their economies for a more inclusive and sustainable future. And then finally, since these packages will require considerable financing, we suggest some options for countries of how to fill these financing gaps. So again, the main messages of the survey this year are that the socio-economic impact of the pandemic was actually amplified in the region by a lack of resilience within economies and the lack of investments in people and the planet, which are basically the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we look forward, what we think is that continuity in the policy support is a must, and recovery packages should focus on building resilience and investing in the 2030 agenda, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And then again, when we look at the past and try to analyze various crises, economic and non-economic shocks, what we find is that a more integrated risk management approach is required to planning and policy making. And finally, what we do propose is this Building Forward Better package, which is mainly concentrated on three areas: social services, digital access, and green development. And once again, to finance this package, countries will need to build up their financing options, build fiscal space, and explore a range of financing options, which we provide some guide to. So, if you look at the present day, I mean, the pandemic has been a stark reminder that health emergencies cause not only the social damage, which is clearly evident on our streets, but also entail economic risks. The economic risks, if you look at it, our forecasts, or well, our numbers for 2020 are quite substantial. And the green being Southeast Asia. As we see, Southeast Asia was even more impacted than Asia Pacific as a whole. So Asia Pacific as a whole had a 1% decline in growth, but for Southeast Asia it was 3.9%. And what this translates into in terms of socioeconomic costs has been very substantial socioeconomic costs. If we look at the sort of hours of work lost, and we convert that into equivalents of full-time jobs, we see that the region as a whole has suffered a loss of 140 million jobs in the year of 2020. And Southeast Asia specifically suffered a loss of 24 million jobs. And then if we look at the poverty impact, we see that in the region as a whole, 89 million people could have been pushed back into extreme poverty at the $1.9 per day level. And if you look at the higher thresholds, the $3.2 level and the $5.5 level, then for the region as a whole, the numbers were 158 million and 172 million. And if you look at Southeast Asia, that's what you see on the graph. For these three different levels, at the $1.9 per day level, it was 4.8 million people, 17.4 at the $3.2 level, and 31.1 million people at the $5.5 level. So very substantial impacts. And then if we look at the economic outlook going forward in 2021, 2022, our forecast for Southeast Asia is a big rise, 4.7% from the minus 3.9% of 2020, and a 4.7% in 2022 as well. Obviously, these large rises are due mainly to the base effect from coming from such a low base. Numbers will tend to be high. If we look further into the details for Southeast Asia, what we can see in even in terms of quarterly numbers was that there has been improvement over the quarters for the region as a whole. And a large part of that has been due to the trade patterns with China, which has seen a 7% increase during the year. And this reveals the value of regional value chains for Southeast Asian economies, the importance of those. However, of course, there's a great diversity in country performance. Only a few countries, such as Vietnam, fully managed to capture this recovery. On the other hand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines remain mired in prolonged pandemic threats and economic disruptions. Malaysia and Thailand, for instance, reimposed nationwide restrictions in the light of new waves of infection. Structural vulnerabilities also are important, such as high economic informality, such as in Cambodia, Indonesia, and Lao PDR, and Myanmar, reliance on remittances in Philippines, and dependence on international tourism, such as in Cambodia and Thailand. Also, all of these aspects exacerbated the impacts of the pandemic and hampered recovery of the countries. Furthermore, there's political instability, which may also cast shadows in the near-term economic outlook in some countries in the region, such as in Myanmar. On the other hand, I mean, when one looks at the outlook for the region, one has grounds for near-term optimism. There's a number of factors behind this optimism. Firstly, this crisis, unlike damage from natural disasters or financial crises, which destroy infrastructure or are a result of underlying weaknesses in the economy, this damage should be temporary. Also, the vaccine rollout has started in the region, which could further accelerate the recovery. Third, many of the stimulus packages deployed in 2020 are multi-year programs, and we expect the fiscal and monetary policies to stay accommodative. Fourthly, the strong export and regional value chains offer a buffer to external shocks. And finally, major economies worldwide are gradually recovering, offering some hope in terms of aggregate demand for the region's exports. However, there are also a number of very substantial downside risks. The success of the vaccination programs will be highly important, and that depends on the speed of progress. By mid-April 2021, all Southeast Asian countries have begun nationwide vaccination programs, with Timor-Leste being the final country in the region receiving vaccines. So this bodes well for the recovery process for the region, if the momentum is maintained. However, a key concern has been the varying levels of access to vaccines among countries. There are even concerns among some analyses that most of Southeast Asia would not achieve widespread coverage in vaccinations till late next year. So these uncertainties in vaccination and the ongoing lockdown measures are particularly undermining some key sectors of the economy, such as tourism. And then when we look at the recovery policies, fiscal and monetary stimulus for recovery, this will put a burden on that. And also long-lasting productivity damages due to the crisis could impede a supply-side recovery. In the sub-region, if we think about Southeast Asia, Laos, PDR, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Vietnam have significantly higher debt levels than the developing world average, so are particularly prone to the problems coming from the extra fiscal stress. Finally, global capital flow uncertainties, which we've seen in the beginning of the crisis, and now possibly when, again, global interest rates go up or in the developed world, that could be another strain on economies. Then there's the approaching risk of stagflation as interest rates go up, and lingering trade tensions also between the developed and developing world. So all of these, I mean, the slowdown in the economies that we've seen over the last year or so, and which a key lesson that we've learned from previous crises and that we see in this crisis as well, that these crises result in a permanent loss of output. So even though this very high growth will come in the next year or two, that does not recover all of the output lost. Indeed, if we think about Asia Pacific, our calculations show that a staggering $2.6 trillion will be lost between 2020 and 2022 in Asia Pacific developing economies. And actually, in about half of the Asia Pacific developing economies, output will be 10% lower than the pre-pandemic trend. In Southeast Asia, which we show here in the graph, the cumulative output loss between 2020 and 2022 is expected to be $591 billion. So again, a very substantial output loss due to the crisis, which is permanent. If we look within the countries of the region, this output loss, as you can see from the graph, it's actually Southeast Asia stands out as being even more affected than developing ESCAP economies as a whole in terms of the output loss. And then if one looks among the countries, one sees that the countries most affected are Philippines, Myanmar, and Cambodia, for example. And the losses tend to be related to the speed of the control of the virus and vaccination programs, as well as dependence on particularly affected sectors, such as tourism. And another problem with the recovery from the crisis is what we call a K-shaped recovery. Which means that there's a disproportionate impact of the crisis on poor and vulnerable groups. This is driven by three main factors, and we can separate the countries into the developed and the developing world. What we see between these two groups are uneven progress in vaccine rollout, limited fiscal space in the developing countries, especially those countries where public support is needed the most, and difference in the ability of the poor and rich to adapt to the post-pandemic changes in our lifestyle, which means changes such as access to distance learning and teleworking, which require IT capabilities, for example. So what we outline as the near-term policy priorities for countries in the region are, first, to put the pandemic control first. And within this, regional and bilateral cooperation will also be important to complement global support in the vaccination programs. As we've seen, there's a great deal of vaccine nationalism going on in the world currently, and that's severely hampering the ability of countries to respond. Again, another thing is, for the robust recovery, the policies should prioritize inclusiveness. Why are inclusive policies required? We think there are three key benefits of inclusive policies. One is that it would shorten the pandemic threat for all people in the country, because if you do not vaccinate all, or if you do not prioritize all people, in the end, no sector of society will be left safe. And then also reduce the risk of post-pandemic social unrest if people feel that they're being unfairly treated. And then also most effectively support a rebound in aggregate demand. When all sectors of society recover, they can spend again, and that improves economic performance. And the other policy priority is a strong case for continuation of fiscal monetary support that we've already seen this year to be continued for the recovery. So the survey also looks at the past to try and understand previous crises and what we can learn from them for economies to build their resilience in the future. If you look at Southeast Asia, within all the data that we've collected, which you have for the whole of the Asia-Pacific region, we analyzed countries from the 1960s until the 2010s, looked at a whole host of crises, ranging from banking crises, trade crises, to epidemics, pandemics, and climate-related crises. And what we see over time is that while the financial crises have gone down in some sense over the decades, natural disasters and pandemics have become more frequent. And in the sub-region, particularly, and actually in Asia Pacific as a whole, some countries from the sub-region are particularly affected by such crises, these being Philippines and Vietnam, as well as Indonesia. And the crises, as I mentioned, tend to be more related to climate and epidemics than to financial issues. And what are the effects of such crises on countries? What we find is that these shocks from crises of all types leave long-term scars. For example, if we look at financial crises, 5 years after such crisis in the region, investment had collapsed by about 10%. If you look at pandemics, what was the impact on inequality was for the Gini coefficient to increase by 0.3% after crises such as SARS, H1N1, and MERS. And all disasters, including natural disasters, affected environmental performance significantly. But the good news is that policy choices matter in terms of the impact of such crises. And what we see that certain good policies include counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policies, flexible exchange rates, and social protection. These all serve as important shock absorbers for economies. Also, external financing sources such as remittances and ODA can mitigate the impact on poverty. We also find that diversified economies suffer less environmental damage. But on the other hand, pre-existing structural vulnerabilities such as poor quality of governance or infrastructure or health and social protection systems can amplify shocks. So what we see, again, in terms of the impact of shocks, is that these shocks were much less prevalent or much more muted in countries which had these good policies, which include high public health spending, less vulnerable employment, and high quality infrastructure. We see in terms of the impact on GDP per capita, consumption, and human capital. So some of the lessons learned from this long-term analysis of crises in the region is, firstly, that countries should respond strongly and swiftly to shocks to safeguard sustainable development. Again, here, this analysis of previous crises shows that the difference between countries which had supportive policies and others which did not, and the much greater impact on GDP per capita, human capital, and environmental performance negatively from countries which did not have supportive policies. A second lesson learned is that risk management should be fully integrated into national development planning and policy making. This involves aspects such as effective crisis preparation and coping strategies, such as early warning systems and insurance mechanisms. The third lesson is to strengthen the resilience of vulnerable countries. So here, if we look at Southeast Asia, we see, if we compare them with OECD Asia-Pacific countries, along a number of different measures that capture resilience, such as what are their sovereign credit ratings, what is the state of their exchange rate regimes, the quality of infrastructure, social protection expenditure, we see that Southeast Asian countries lag behind in all of these measures. And some of the key priorities for countries in the regions in Southeast Asia about increasing the resilience are enhancing fiscal space for crisis response and addressing deficits in social and physical infrastructure. So then the study looks at the future and how to build forward better as countries design recovery packages. So what we find is that current recovery packages, which are online for countries, are not as inclusive and sustainable as we would have wanted. For example, if one looks at the issue of gender sensitivity of policies, one looks at areas like fiscal support for businesses, social protection, and labor markets, and one finds that the gender-related components are very small. Again, if one looks at publicly funded commitments on in the recovery packages which address green issues, we find that clean, unconditional commitments are very few. Clean, conditional commitments are somewhat greater, but still the major focus of such policies remains on fossil fuels. And so there's a great deal of room for improvement. So what we do is we propose in this study a Building Forward Better policy package, which involves three particular elements. One is social services, which involves areas such as access to healthcare and a social protection floor, digital access, which we know now in this post-pandemic world and during the pandemic has been critical. So areas such as ICT investment and education spending, and then green development areas, so which involves a gamut of issues, biodiversity, investment in climate resilient infrastructure, in clean energy and energy efficiency, and also funding this, in a sense, funding all of our policies, but also changing the incentive structure by removing fuel subsidies and increasing carbon taxes. And implementing such a policy package, which we analyze, shows that for Southeast Asia, for example, as well as for the region, there are significant impacts, significant benefits for a host of variables related to inclusive and sustainable development. What we describe as the ambitious spending package here is the package to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which we analyzed in the previous Economic and Social Survey of the Asia Pacific last year. And the business as usual package would be one which follows the current financing abilities of countries. So one can see that, of course, the ambitious spending package achieves far higher benefits for economies. For example, in Southeast Asia, almost 20 million people would escape poverty at the $5.5 a day level, whereas in the business as usual scenario, this would be only 10 million people. Carbon emissions also under the ambitious spending proposal would be nearly 40% below the baseline in Southeast Asia by 2030, by 2040. And air quality would improve substantially, as well as inequality. Of course, these policies do have an impact on fiscal resources of countries. And so we analyze also what the impacts will be on the debt situation of countries. In Southeast Asia, for example, debt would go up by 2030 from 50% of GDP to 60% of GDP under the spending package. but even otherwise, even without the spending package itself, COVID-19 itself would have caused spending to go up by about 5%. So really, the spending for Southeast Asia as a whole is not, we believe, out of reach, especially for many countries in the region, though there is great diversity within countries. For example, Indonesia would need to spend about 6% of GDP annually, but Cambodia, on the other hand, as a least developed country, has a greater way to go and would have to spend about 14% of GDP annually. The Philippines, maybe 6% of GDP, whereas Vietnam, about 10% of GDP. So to address these financing needs for countries, we also suggest a number of options which can help in meeting the fiscal challenges. One is to actively engage in the debt relief initiatives. If you look at the DSSI, the debt suspension initiative of the G20, only Myanmar out of Southeast Asia is participating, although 4 Southeast Asian countries are eligible. So Myanmar is participating and could have a potential saving of $380 million. For example, Lao PDR is not participating, despite having a high risk of debt distress, and could have had a large potential saving of $315 million. Also, if one considers the kind of debt that countries have in the sub-region in Southeast Asia, we see that quite a lot of it is owed to China bilaterally, Cambodia, Lao PDR, and Myanmar, again, which offers a great scope for engaging in debt relief negotiations on a bilateral basis. One aspect also of debt relief is debt swaps for development. If you think about this, Indonesia and the Philippines have actually engaged in such debt swaps in the past, in the 1980s and early 2000s. And in Indonesia, the debt swaps, for example, helped raise about $385 million over a 20-year period. Another suggestion is for offshore bonds, which is such as ones done by the Lao PDR in Thailand. They've issued 43 Thai-denominated bonds in Thailand with a value of about 2.1 billion at size. And so that's a potential source of how countries can engage with other countries in the sub-region with more active bond markets and use that as a source of funding. Also, there are diaspora bonds, which, for example, the Philippines and Vietnam could benefit from due to the large remittance flows. Another aspect is incorporating catastrophic risk into fiscal planning. We know, for example, that Cambodia, Lao PDR, and Myanmar face a large funding gap when dealing with recurrent or major disaster events. So there's a great scope of work to do there. In that sense, there's a very hopeful sign. The Southeast Asian countries did agree to the ASEAN COVID-19 Response Fund to secure necessary medical supplies for immediate response and prevention. So that's a good sign of regional cooperation. And also, one can see good signs in the region in terms of Indonesia and Vietnam having insurance schemes for public assets. And the final suggestion is to ease the investment rules for pension and sovereign wealth funds to invest in government bonds. And for example, we know that Brunei, Malaysia, and Timor-Leste have very sizable sovereign wealth funds, which could be playing such a role. One indication of the problem, for example, is that in Indonesia, if one considers the sovereign wealth fund, the pension funds, they're not allowed to invest currently in foreign equities and bonds. So that's a kind of example of area which could be altered through government policy. So basically, the main messages from the survey are that while we are cautiously optimistic about the outlook for the region, there is a major risk of a K-shaped recovery. And so the call of the day for policymakers is to prioritize inclusiveness for a robust recovery. And looking in the long term, countries should also analyze the wider risk landscape and focus on reducing setbacks as well as accelerating progress on sustainable development. And finally, that this pandemic does present an opportunity to build forward better during our recovery packages. And these should focus on the 3 key areas of social services, digital access, and climate action. So thank you very much. The link to the survey is here on the last page, and I'm sure we'll be circulating that in the chat box as well. And also just to mention that We'd also have an evaluation form, which will be circulated in the chat box about this event, which we would be very happy if you did fill up at the end of the event. Thank you very much.
The report has already been in the chat box, and the main messages from the presentation was that the pandemic has actually amplified the lack of resilience and investments in the people and planet. And first and foremost, recovery packages should continue to build resilience and invest in the 2030 agenda. There is a bit of positive outlook for Southeast Asia, but we are still not yet out of the woods, forest, or jungle. So countries, governments still need to continue in building forward better, particularly on policy packages that call for investments in the three areas of social services, digital access, and green development. So thank you very much. We will now proceed with our next speaker, Ibu Diandra Pratami, who is the Development Coordination Officer and Economist at the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator in Indonesia. She provides inputs to the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework 2021 to 2025 in Indonesia. The purpose of having Ibu Diandra is to, again, this is one of the efforts of the UN One Approach, where activities, initiatives of the UN need to be better coordinated or enhanced, both at the regional, through the regional commissions such as ESCAP, and also with the UN country teams like Indonesia. So with that, may I give the floor to Ibu Diandra for her presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Roni. Allow me to share my screen. And I hope you all can see them.
Yes, we can, Ibu. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to congratulate ESCAP for having launched this flagship annual survey report and for organizing this very important event that is tailored for Southeast Asian countries. Thanks for having UN Indonesia. I'll representing the UN Resident Coordinator Office as explained, and we will provide a country perspective from Indonesia on the survey report. Here is the outline of my presentation. I'll begin with providing you some updates on COVID-19 development in the country and how it then affected the SDGs progress in Indonesia. As you might be aware that Indonesia will present as well for the third time the voluntary national review of the implementation of SDGs this year through UN HLPF. We will also provide a reflection of the survey report and what it means as well for the country. As WHO situation report mentioned that the cases in Indonesia had reached more than 1.6 million, which means the biggest for Southeast Asia region, with more than 45,000 people dead. And the incidence had reached 13.5 per 100,000 population, although this number fluctuates. And I'd like to also acknowledge that the government had made effort in rolling out the vaccination. At least there is 7 million people already get a second dose, which have been fully vaccinated. This includes people with priority population groups such as health workers, essential public service workers, and the elderly. Like many other countries, it indeed affected the gains made in the progress for the SDGs achievement, including in Indonesia. So the pandemic, with its restriction policy, as mentioned, had resulted in the economy contraction and also affected the progress made in employment, which has resulted, according to statistics, with more than 24 million people worked reduced hours, and 2.5 million people at least have lost completely their jobs. This means that poverty rate increased, representing a 3-year setback in the last 3 years, and then income inequality also increased by 0.05%. With reduced income, there is a threat to food security and nutrition. The latest survey also reported that high income shocks or income reduction making parents couldn't afford to pay for school fees, so that there is an expectation or a forecast that there might be a higher increase in dropout rates resulting from this pandemic. There is also some of the studies that we found also mentioned that this economic distress or economic income reduction also caused an increased level of gender-based violence in the home. On the other note, health system is overstretched with the different disruptions that are evident across essential health services. This includes immunization, HIV, TB, malaria, and so on and so forth. In the next slides, I'll provide the reflection of the survey report to Indonesia. As mentioned before, this is not unique to Indonesia that the economy is contracted. Despite the policy for the restriction policy is essential to curb the pandemic. However, according to different institutions, including through ESCAP, through this report, that 2021 is seen as a year of recovery, all agree. The government itself predicted that the economy will grow in the range between 4.4% to 5.3% this year. ESCAP, you will see OECD and IMF have similar optimism that support this idea. The World Bank has a little optimistic on economic projection for Indonesia, and we also noted that, for example, here the EIU think that maybe Indonesia can only grow by 3.3%, a little much less optimistic as the other institutions have forecasted. I'm impressed by the chapter to report the past, which is understanding the shocks that we've been through for us to be aware of and to be prepared for. And I'd like to share some of the examples of the challenges that Indonesia faced. The report mentioned that countries with more formal workers will be much more resilient than those who are not. Yeah, again, Indonesia is not the case where we have quite high economic informality. Even COVID-19 make it worse. However, the government tried to extend their assistance and social protection to these informal workers through different cash transfers, through reallocation of village fund to fund the social protection, food aid, electricity subsidies, loan deferrals, and subsidies for the SMEs, which are part of the informal sectors. I'd like to also share how people who are at risk to be left behind were impacted by the COVID-19 in the country. As we understand from my previous slide, that the government had expanded their social protection program. However, according to survey recently conducted by UNICEF, UNDP, DFAT in Indonesia, found that there is 1/3 of the households in the bottom 40% of the economic quintile, economic distribution that still didn't receive any cash assistance, showing that they are still left behind to receive the cash assistance. Similarly, migrant workers couldn't get the job or couldn't out-migrate because of this border closure. And people living with HIV not only receiving their reduced income, but also experiencing changes and disruption in their services. Either they are feared because of getting possibility of getting contracted, or the public service facilities are closed. Children, again, there are many reports mentioning that they are suffering because of this economic distress in the households by their parents. And refugees also a concern because they cannot work in the country and they may not receive support from their family abroad. The country is also facing a significant risk of natural disasters, as mentioned by Suphajit's presentation. Indonesia have to deal with, at least last year, almost 3,000 natural disaster events. And you noted here, while earthquakes and volcanoes are causing large impacts, climate change related disasters are far, far more frequent. You will see that Indonesia in a day will have to deal with 3 floods and 2 landslides across the country, emphasizing the need for increased capacity for local government, but also adaptive social protection and early warning system. Moving on to comment on the Building Forward Better package as presented in the report. Indonesia continued its national economic recovery program this year, although you may note that there is a reduction in social protection allocation this year in 2021. So we may need to caution about this decision as well. Indonesia had also tripled its fiscal budget deficit to respond to this COVID-19 pandemic. It would be worth mentioning how aggressive or clarifying or discussing how aggressive Indonesia has been, maybe to also inform the government here. And Indonesia had also increased the debt to GDP ratio, sailing from 30% to 60%. Now it reached already 40% of GDP. ESCAP had made a great effort in producing the analysis and policy options. The question would be how to get buy-in from the government, and what we would like to propose is to repeatedly promote this package. You can utilize us, UN country team that are available in the country, engaging different partners, and as well what you do as well today, having policy dialogue involving different think tank and also NGOs probably. It is also important to note the cost of not aggressive action, although it's already mentioned for Southeast Asia region. It will be useful as well what are the opportunity costs for Indonesia especially. And while it is easier to promote additional spending for social services, digital access, it would be challenging, I will note, to promote action against green economy, as we noted in the report that Indonesia had already policies that hinder the green recovery. This includes subsidies for harmful products and recent tax deduction for cars, for example, that are using fossil fuel. We would like to also note that there is a political economy in this decision, where it is not easy to increase the debt to GDP ratio. It is not easy to increase the fiscal deficit because we need a legal basis for that and require some approval from the parliament as well. The survey report had mapped also financing options and instruments for different scenarios, which are extremely useful for us and for policymakers. The question may be, it can be answered later, but our comment would be why budgetary allocation are not advised for high severity shock in this report, while Indonesia use or take or opt for these options during COVID-19, but also in the other disasters. This is my last slide. I'd like to share what Indonesia had explored in terms of financing and fiscal policies. Indonesia, of course, did budget allocation, although there is a risk that the other development areas are not funded. Therefore, a question on whether we will achieve those development areas. And as mentioned before, we have to have a legal basis to be able to increase the cap. Indonesia had issued different bonds and also had loans with different multilateral agencies, as some of the countries had also done do a central bank to buy different local currency bonds. It will also continue this year in 2021, this burden sharing scheme. And for the first time, Indonesia will is also issuing the sovereign wealth funds, although some of the room for improvement were mentioned by Sufojit in his previous presentation. I'll stop here and welcome for your feedback and question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Diandra, for the excellent and comprehensive presentation. And I also like to congratulate you for making the presentation while fasting during this holy month of Ramadan. So in the presentation, Ibu Diandra highlighted that although progress has been made again, as well as similar to other Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia needs to continue with its current efforts, and particularly from the UN, we are trying to see how we can work closely with the UN country teams of Indonesia, with the government, as well as to engage further with development banks, perhaps such as our World Bank and ADB, and also donor governments who are particularly committed in supporting Indonesia with its COVID recovery. So from Indonesia, we moved to the Mekong region, and this is one of the main sub-regions of Southeast Asia. And for this session, we have invited Kun Suryan Vijit Lekan, who is Executive Director at the Mekong Institute. He holds over 15 years of experience in delivering innovative approaches and sustainable practices across the specialized areas of agriculture, rural development, public and private partnerships. Prior to the Mekong Institute, Mr. Suryan was the Deputy Cluster Coordinator for Food and Agriculture of the GIZ, and also spokesperson of the Agriculture Working Group under the GIZ Sectoral Network for Natural Resources and Rural Development in Asia and the Pacific. So for this presentation, we are pleased to manage it from our side, Suryan. So with that, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, the host, the organizer, ESCAP, for launching the report. I have gone through it, and it's very informative and insightful. And particularly if those who are keen in looking at the current development on the topic in Southeast Asia, you will find that it's quite complementing to the earlier released report in trying to understand the socio-economic impacts resulted from COVID-19, as well as how Southeast Asia in general would trying to recover itself. My presentation intend to provide reflection, comments, and suggest some of the possible initiatives that ESCAP, Mekong Institute, and other organizations may look at, so that we can embrace the concept of build forward better. Next, please. So, what perhaps I would like just to spend some minutes to reflect upon the survey report is that the nature of the COVID impacts, as what has been earlier presented by Sufojit, that is not only on the health sector and also economic performance, but it's really create so-called a set of crises and chain reaction on impacts to society, to country, and even to sub-regions, to the whole region. There are a situation where we need to really trying to embrace and understand better, for example, the relocation of people, the worker who are staying in city, going back to provinces, the problems of labor migration, the issue of difficulties of SMEs to really withstand the quite highly fluctuated business difficulties. All of these are in fact not yet carefully assessed. So what I'm trying to say here is that the COVID, unlike any other previously occurred crisis, it really cut deep the impact to society, and it create a longer term scar, as what Chuwojit said earlier. I also would like just to say a few words about the COVID-19 status, looking at how the situation has been in many countries. Despite the positive near future opportunity, we need to admit that it's still far from over. So a situation like in Thailand, for example, we have done well last year, but due to the second wave and third wave, now situation get back to difficult situation again. Looking into the lockdown in Cambodia, in Vientiane, and so on and so forth, situation in the Philippines and Indonesia, it indicates that the work towards recovery is really highly fluctuated and unpredictable. It's very uncertain. So it's quite difficult for us to really foresee how things would look like. Although positive, as what many people said, is still in a very fragile stage. Impact, as I said, yeah, will cut deep and provide long-term scar, as what Chuwojit said, and there is no linear pathway. Even some of the countries that show a good performance in terms of COVID response may also experience difficulties, for example, like Thailand and also many other countries. Uneven recovery, particularly those of Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, also will create concern, not only in terms of exacerbate the already difficult socio-economic situation, but also in terms of advancing the sub-regional and regional agenda, and not to mention about the global campaign on sustainable development. So when I go through the report kindly launched by ESCAP, I also find that reading it together with other reports, such as the ADB recovery plan, the midterm review of ASEAN Economic Community midterm review report, it has some underlying message. It sort of complementing each other, giving a better understanding of what scenario trend policy package has been. So in this case, I think this is quite a useful report. It provides insight, informative, and give an idea on how we can collectively look into the future. Of course, one of the difficulties, as what I can foresee from the countryside, looking at all this report framework and things like that, is to see how each of the country can really reconcile all this framework and look into synergies. So as individual country themselves can really take a concrete steps toward how recovery look like and how they can set priorities. Because many countries, while supporting the policy packages and framework, there are two major difficulties they are currently experiencing. One is physical capacity. Second is about human institutional capacity to implement such policy packages. So to me, these are two underlying difficulties that many countries, including the Mekong sub-region, are currently facing. Then capacity, as what I said, much of it remain to be in the actual implementation, where in later stage I will dive deeper to that. Next, please. Looking into Southeast Asia, for those who are following the discussion on COVID-related economic recovery, you'll find that there's already some sort of a good efforts done by a number of forums, ASEAN, ADB, Greater Mekong sub-region, and you can see from the screen that there are policy framework and document laid out. I find that all of these provide directions on how COVID is integrated into existing regional policy framework. The issue will be boiled down to how country will respond to it. These are currently a difficult situation that many countries are experiencing. Then I would admit that despite good effort made in response and recovery of COVID, we could expect more regional coordinated intervention or cooperation. I find that this is still an area that we haven't seen so much. Of course, we sympathize, trying to support each other, but so-called regional approach of response, of recovery has yet to be seen in a concrete manner. Again, implementation issues remain to be fundamental difficult factors. Next, please. Having said that, I would like just to share a few thoughts about how we can take it from here, particularly looking at taking the concept of build forward better into the implementation, help the country to set course of directions and see the priorities that fit their needs. Also, in response to the current situation of COVID outbreak and preparing for medium and longer term recovery strategy. My underlying point would be the capacity of translating those policy packages and framework into the implementation. Much of it remains to be seen in the knowledge and know-how. The issue of integrating risk management is, in fact, has been promoted quite a number of years from Sendai framework, also taken up by ASEAN, and try to promote how we can really develop a more integrated disaster climate risk financing, for example. That's been implemented over time, but when it trickled down to how the country implement it, this oftentimes seen as a very, a focused kind of effort by a few agencies. It's not really built into a more national policy planning and country planning exercise. Is not taken up by relevant agency concerned, even trickle down to the provincial or local implementation. So I thought that perhaps capacity and how we can support in terms of providing knowledge and know-how in support implementation will be something very important so that we can advance this. There are a few issues that I would like to highlight, particularly if we want to seriously promote the build forward better. If we find that this could be an opportunity to promote sustainable development, core benefits. I find that many sectors, while embracing the concept of sustainable development, green economy, but the real enthusiasm of really taking it seriously is still not much can be seen. This due to the fact that they don't see much of the core benefits, particularly compared to the area of their responsibility and what are the existing business model that can create scale. These are one of the issues I thought that perhaps we can look at. So integrating risk management, I echo with full support, but we need to see how it trickled down to the provincial level. Many cases, things will boil down to how existing legislative framework would allow us to implement or how we can do things better, particularly supporting build forward better. But what I would like to propose is that oftentimes we look more on legal reform rather than looking in terms of utilizing what are existing available and adopt more of good regulatory practices. This way would allow us to do what we can to the extent that at least we can see a coherent kind of existing legal framework, looking in terms of consistency of implementation, transparency, and governance. So this kind of mainstreaming good regulatory practices should at least allow us to do what we can and do not wait for legal reform that would support so-called sustainable development or build forward better. In case of mekong countries, as I said earlier, there are more opportunity where we can work together, particularly looking at issue of impact of COVID-19, where there are cross-border, some regional coordinated approach could be adopted. Along that line, I would like to propose that perhaps we can utilize the existing regional economic corridors as a showcase, as a lighthouse, so that we can demonstrate how things are done and trickle down effect at the local level. Peer-to-peer learning from how each country really prepare their national recovery plan, help each other to support how country can bridge the gap, because some of the country do need support. Capturing opportunity and transitioning to green economy, particularly trying to look into the expectation from consumer, from the industry, from the financier. All of these are elements where we can put together in order to support the implementation of build forward better policy packages. Next, please. This is my last slide. And when Mekong Institute received guidance from our Greater Mekong sub-region countries, we are now looking at how we can really prepare a program where over the next 12 to 18 months, we can focus on very targeted support. And again, I emphasize the implementation support, so that country, not only in terms of prepare their national recovery strategy, but they also equip with necessary capacity, know-how, and knowledge to advance the implementation, learn from each other, so that we can see how the concept is really put into practice. So there are three areas that I would like to propose. One is about the actual life protection. Of course, there's still the work of COVID response to public health that is still a concern, but continue to work on public health alone. We have learned from the previous disaster that applying One Health approach could create a more better opportunity, a more holistic approach, and perhaps these are the opportunity where we can already reintroduce and see how One Health approach could help addressing public health and prepare for a longer term so-called universal health concept, human, animal, and environment. Second area that I think it would be needed over 1.5 years is to really find ways to really protect the vulnerable and the poor. And this also including the so-called SME. We have learned from the past that one of the best economic activity that support the rural community is to look into creative economy. And this year is also has been announced by UNCTAD as International Year of Creative Economy. This creative economy is not only to provide a quick help to the poor and vulnerable group, but it's also provide a more longer term rural economy that we can tap on creative art and product and turn it into a more inclusive economy. There is also potential of domestic market, intra-sub-regional markets, and also labor mobility that we need to look at, because if we want to look into recovery, this domestic intra-sub-regional market can provide a quick wins. Labor mobility will be a soon issues, because now migrant labor is moving everywhere in the country, across country. How they will be brought back in order to support economic activities will be something very important. How the government prepare for labor migration management systems, that information is shared so that we are not only looking in terms of labor management, but also monitor how the COVID and the public health related issue are also addressed. Last but not the least is how we can ensure that Mekong sub-region remain to open the borders and also accelerate economic activities. And I would think that in order to support this, focus should be given to micro, small and medium enterprises, because these are the majority supporting the economy in the Mekong sub-region. And I would think the following 4 areas are the most prominent, important sector or area where it's not only helping to address the need of the people, but can prepare for a longer term economic development and integration. Transport, logistics, agricultural value chain, tourism, e-commerce, particularly learning on how digitalization has been applied, and now how we can really make use of e-commerce to really help to really boost the economic activities in a short term and prepare for a longer term development. So Ronnie, let me stop here, and I would be ready for responding to any question asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun Suryan, for another excellent presentation. Kun Suryan provided insights into the report of the Survey 2021 from the lens of the Mekong region, and he also provides some comparisons vis-a-vis other regional reports, and has shown that there are some complementarities or areas of mutual interest recommended in terms of the policy. Spoken like a true policy practitioner, he emphasized implementation in many of these measures and policy initiatives, and how capacity building at the national, even at the local level, is very important. So thank you, Kun Suryan. Moving to our final speaker is from OECD, Dr. Kensuke Tanaka. He is the head of the Asia desk at the OECD Development Center. He has initiated and is in charge of several publications, including the biannual flagship publication, OECD Economic Outlook for Southeast Asia, China, and India. So with that, can I give the floor to Dr. Kensuke, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Maybe. Okay. Okay. Can you see my slide?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Okay. I would like to, first I'd like to thank you, ESCAP, for this opportunity. And I see this report very interesting, and we share many comments. And I also share many points with Deandra and Suryan, who provide comments previously. In this intervention, and I'd like to mention several key policy responses and options as a complementary insight of this report. And first, I'd like to touch on the impact of the pandemic on the economic growth on ASEAN, and then discuss 6 policy issues. And my insights are more or less, sorry. Okay. My insights are based on our flagship publication of the OECD Economic Outlook for Southeast Asia, China, and India. Let me start with growth. Our views is more or less similar with the UNESCAP report. Growth in ASEAN was weak in 2020, and we anticipate ASEAN economy will rebound in 2021 at 5.1%. And we think that the uncertainty will be still high in 2021 in the region. These high numbers are basically more or less the base year effect. And economic impact of the COVID-19 will be very different among countries. For instance, Vietnam shows a resilience, while the Philippines suffered historically severe contraction, for instance. And let me touch on some unique feature of COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 crisis is different from other crises, such as Asian financial crisis and global financial crisis in the past. These are usually categorized as a demand shock, but the COVID-19 crisis is caused by both demand and supply shocks. Therefore, shocks has resulted in broader economic damages to all sectors, including manufacturing and services. If we compare with the past crisis, job loss during the COVID-19 crisis has been much bigger than the previous recessions, as you can see on the red bar for each country. This is particularly visible in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, although the full effects of the pandemic on the labor markets remain uncertain. Next, let me touch on some policy responses, in particular near-term reaction and health, monetary, and fiscal fronts. And the first immediate response needed is in the area of health, as the ESCAP report emphasized. Policymakers in emerging Asia must continue to strengthen their pandemic management strategy. Current good practice should be scaled up, adding more emphasis on prevention. And resource allocation must ensure an adequate supply of protective equipment and also training for health professionals. The distribution of the vaccine requires strategies that engage both practical aspects and scientific considerations. And more recently, developing strategies to cope with uncertainty related to new mutation of the virus has become critical. Another key response is a monetary reaction. So far, accommodative monetary policies have helped to keep funding costs stable, but at the same time, they have made additional interest rate cuts difficult. Traditional monetary policy tools, such as yield curve control policy, also have limitations, and policies to improve monetary policy transmission may be needed. For instance, a shift to average inflation targeting or similar adjustment may be useful. And another policy suggestion is to use natural rate of interest as a complementary benchmark for monetary policy. Next is a fiscal reaction. And over the medium term, most government will experience weakening fiscal position as both public and also private debt level rise. And a fiscal response have been differed among emerging Asian countries, with larger response in Singapore, more than 10% of GDP, and Thailand. Smaller ones, like in general CLM country. Balancing the need for continuous economic support while maintaining fiscal strength is a key challenge for policymakers, and it's critical to focus targeted fiscal spending on the area where it is most needed. Let me move on to the other policy response, long-term policy response mainly, particularly related to digitalization. Especially digital health and digital education, e-learning, and Industry 4.0. The use of the digital health tools has increased during the pandemic. As the figure shows, interest in telemedicine increased as the number of COVID-19 cases grew. In Malaysia, for instance, interest in telemedicine, this is shown in the red bar, was the highest during November 2020, reflecting the rapid increase in the number of COVID-19 cases. This figure shows the huge increase in the number of telemedicine users. In March 2020, daily active users of some platforms from Indonesia and Singapore increased by more than 100% relative to 2019 average. And income and educational attainments are important factors influencing internet adoption and usage. For instance, as you can see in the figure on the right, people with higher incomes are more likely to be internet users. The gap by level of education is more striking, as you can see on the figure on the left. In Indonesia, Philippines, and India, there is more than 40 percentage point difference in internet usage between people with higher education and without. For telemedicine to become an alternative to traditional health care, even after the crisis, many issues need to be addressed. Here is a sort of a list of the policy suggestions. For instance, solid legal frameworks and rules for data protection must be established to develop consumer trust. Reimbursement rules and insurance policy must be modified to reflect the quality of telemedicine and in-person care. And telemedicine service must be easy for care providers and patients to access and use, while lifelong learning will be necessary for medical professionals to use digital health tools effectively. And cybersecurity is also an important issue to improve. And finally, the measures to contain the spread of the virus also affect education. Adapting to a digital environment has been challenging for both students and teachers. Differences in internet coverage and speed have exposed students to different levels of difficulty studying after the closure of schools. As the figure shows, levels of the difficulty may have been lower in countries with a fast and widely available internet, such as China and Singapore. In contrast, it may be more challenging for students living in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar to study remotely. And much progress has been achieved in the area of e-learning over the past years, but several issues remain. Here is again the list of the policy options. And digital infrastructure is still incomplete in some countries, and many teachers need to upgrade their digital skills. And furthermore, the quality of education needs to be maintained in a remote setting. And also Tibet is also the important tool, especially in e-learning in emerging Asia. And lastly, Industry 4.0. Many countries in emerging Asia had started promoting Industry 4.0 before the pandemic. And however, progress is uneven among countries, shaped by country-specific challenges. And this is a list of the initiative of the Industry 4.0 of ASEAN. And some of the most common bottlenecks are, I would say, budgetary constraints and a lack of awareness, and especially among small firms. So these are the policy responses and options to COVID-19 for consideration of this session from my side. And thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question and comment, I will be happy to respond. Thank you very much for your attention again.
Thank you, Kensuke-san, for the very comprehensive report. I think in his intervention, he focused basically on allocating resources for digitalizations as an innovative response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that concludes our panel of speakers. We thank everyone for their intervention. So we will now proceed with our next session, which is the Q&A session, which will be moderated by my colleague Sojung Lee. So with that, can I give the floor to Sojung, please?
Thank you, Ronnie, and thank you to our speakers for your great presentations. I would like to now open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and you'll be invited to address your questions directly to our speakers. When addressing your questions, please turn on your microphone as well as your camera and state your name and organization. Speakers are, of course, welcome to make interventions and ask questions to the other speakers as well. First, I would like to start by addressing a question to Shubhojit. Shubhojit, regional financial cooperation initiatives such as the ASEAN +3 multi-currency bond issue framework have proven to be useful in addressing the diminishing fiscal space seen throughout Southeast Asia. How have such initiatives helped and what could be done further?
Thank you, Sojung, for the question. Yeah, I think regional financial cooperation initiatives can play a very important role in financing. As you were mentioning, the ASEAN +3 multi-currency bond issuance framework was launched to facilitate inter-regional fixed income transactions by promoting common market practices for bond issuance, such as disclosure standards and common documents. Also, similarly, the Asian Bond Market Forum tries to foster the standardization of market practices and harmonization of regulations relating to cross-border bond transactions. One thing to be conscious of those in these initiatives is while they are promoting offshore public bond issuance, this should also be viewed with some caution. It should be realized that issuing bonds offshore in foreign currencies raises a government's vulnerability to exchange rate risks. So really, policymakers in the issuing countries should view these offshore bond policies as a supplement to, rather than a substitute for well-developed capital markets at home. Also, for the host countries, investing in unrated and non-investment grade bonds offers potentially higher yields, but also carries higher risks of default. There are also other things that Asia-Pacific countries and Southeast Asian countries have done to support regional cooperation in responding to the crisis. There were sub-regional emergency funds which were established. For example, at the sub-regional level, you had the SARC, South Asia COVID-19 Emergency Fund in March 2020, which with a combined contribution now of 21 million. Also, the Southeast Asian countries signed up in April 2020 to the ASEAN COVID-19 Response Fund to help secure necessary medical supplies for immediate response and prevention. So definitely we think that regional cooperation can indeed enhance the role of emergency financing mechanisms such as these. The idea is that such cooperation is better because it allows for risk sharing, where the pool of participants is larger and more diverse. But we have to also recognize that when we have a regional approach to emergency funding, that we recognize the diversity in country situations. Maybe for richer countries, they could concentrate on issues such as public infrastructure and manufacturing facilities. But for poorer economies, maybe the issues are more to do with losses in agriculture or rural housing, among other issues. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Shivojit, for your great response. We have a question from Simone. Is there a role for a broad regional unconditional cash transfer focusing on the most vulnerable in the region? Would this question be to a specific speaker, or would it be a much more for all the speakers? Perhaps Deandra, could you address this?
Okay, maybe the ADB or from OECD or from ESCAP can also add. In Indonesia, I guess during COVID-19 response, there are a few unconditional cash transfers being chosen by the government to be able to reach the vulnerable people. This includes again a reallocation of the existing fund of the village fund that was intended for infrastructure building and now moved to an unconditional cash transfers. So the communities, the local communities are empowered to also identify which are the groups or which are the households that would be eligible to be receiving the fund. But also the Ministry of Social Affairs also extend the unconditional cash transfer, not because the existing, the ongoing or regular program was the conditional cash transfers for children, for households with children and households with pregnant mothers. Now, with the COVID-19, the Ministry of Social Affairs also added this unconditional cash transfer to additional vulnerable people. So that's what we can add.
Thank you, Deandra. Would there be any other speaker that would like to add to what Deandra said? If not, we will continue with the next question. Perhaps to Surian. Low-skilled, low-income workers have been marginalized throughout the process of digitalization in terms of adapting to new technologies and job requirements. What policies have been implemented to address the issue, and what are the key difficulties in supporting such vulnerable groups?
Yes, thank you, Sojung. If I could separate the issue into two broad area, one is about migrant worker that support industry, service sector. I think this is best to be addressed through the so-called labor migration management, and this has been already there is a progress in terms of working with the country of origin, country in destination, but much of it remains to be seen in enhancing effective communication, provide also a platform where private sector could also take part in. But for no skill or very limited skill, to me, I think the best way to reach out, as I said during my presentation, is to bring the economy closer to rural community. And this is why I mentioned about creative economy. Creative economy has been promoted over the past 10 years, and we collected some sort of enough evidence and successes. The issue is how we can promote in wider scale. And the bottleneck now that we experience is how we can move away from some sort of creative art, creative product to creative economy, where this so-called limited skill or no skill labor in the rural area can really access and be part of this creative economy. So these are two broad directions that I think it's already been practiced. The issue is about the scale of success and implementation. Back to you, Sojung.
Thank you, Suryan. We have one more question for you. Regarding the One Health approach, which will be practiced among Mekong region, a participant wants to know a bit more about the approach. Could you provide a bit more detail about it?
Yes, thank you. The One Health approach has been developed by quite a number of UN organizations, which is basically looking in terms of human health, animal health, and also environmental health, because all these three components or elements are interrelated. We already experienced this in the past during the so-called avian flu crisis, and particularly the issue of zoonotic disease, meaning to say that this is an animal disease that infected to people. Then in order to work towards more sustainable development, so we should not try to address public health in isolation, but try to really understand how the interplay of so-called these three elements health would be promoted. Up until now, there's been a number of initiatives that's been implemented, led by ASEAN Secretariat. USAID also support the implementation of One Health in the region. FAO, OIE, WHO also support. But this limit within a very small circle, I would hope that the concept of One Health will be introduced to a broader sector and embraced not only among the scholar and line ministry, but looking in terms of how it supports better preparedness, response, and control. To me, these are something that we can work out and also make sure that in Build Forward Better, it is part of integrated policy package. Back to you, Sojung.
Thank you, Suryan, for your great response. Going further, question to Kensuke. In terms of promoting digitization, what has been done to increase the digital access of vulnerable groups, including informal, migrant, and female workers in sectors deeply impacted by COVID-19? Perhaps you could provide a broad perspective across Southeast Asia. Kensuke, you're muted.
All right, okay. Thank you, Sojun. And indeed, it's a good question. And how to use digital tool effectively will be a key in a COVID reaction. And indeed, this sector is one of the sectors increased value during the pandemic. When at the same time, the digital disparity became visible in ASEAN during pandemic. And of course, the level will be different by countries. And so there are several policy reactions we can think about, but of course, to some extent, the action will be different in the different policy areas. For instance, in the education area, I would say the most important is ICT infrastructure and basically access to internet, and especially the CLM country, and the data access and the coverage and the capability of the internet networks. These are first policy reaction I think country need to improve. And then the quality of online education, this also related to the exam administration and other components. And also the teachers and instructors in increasing the digital skills. And these are actually the important things to actually make the digital disparity small, and also more effective use of the Tibet and also the lifelong learning. These are, I think, not necessarily well utilized in ASEAN countries. And for instance, in the area of the digital health, I think the infrastructure is still an important area reaction in this area as well. But at the same time, for instance, the regulatory framework need to be to simplify, and also the data protection rules. And these are, I think, the most important policy reaction, especially to cope with the digital divide during the pandemic. And thank you.
Thank you, Kensuke. We have one more question. On the K-shaped recovery in a very pragmatic way, what can be done in the short term to lay the foundation for such approach to be sustained in the long term? Perhaps, Shuvit, if you could address this question, please.
Sure. I think, I think the points reiterate some of the arguments that we were making in the publication, which was that short-term measures which can be taken. First thing is to contain the pandemic. Without that, nothing can proceed in terms of equal recovery from among vulnerable groups. So really, a wide and inclusive pandemic protection system. And then in terms of the recovery measures, issues to do with inclusiveness must be prioritized. So really measure to support the vulnerable groups in any kind of government spending. And then finally, I'd say that, that as we mentioned, that the fiscal and monetary support measures, the strong measures which have been taken this last year, have to be continued for the next few years. And though debt situations may be affected to some extent, they're manageable for most countries, and for the most countries most in need, there needs to be support from the international community to allow that spending to proceed. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your response. We have one more question. I think we can have this as an open question to all the speakers. Given that this is primarily still a health crisis, is there more that can be done regionally and or multilaterally to refocus or increase immediate aid and cooperation towards equal access to vaccine and effective treatments? Kensuke, would you like to take? Yes, please.
Maybe I will probably break the ice, and then maybe other might follow later. I think the first perhaps reaction, I think the important is a safe and efficient and equitable distribution of vaccine. Maybe that would be the first probably thing to do at the regional level, and especially like appropriate logistical infrastructure, in particular cold storage facilities, and sometimes someone says the cold value chain. These are still perhaps there's a room to improve, and also the vaccine allocation somehow clearly there is a room for cooperation. And then another maybe area in health, perhaps maybe training health professionals, especially in time of COVID. Because we can see some disparities among ASEAN in this point. So maybe some effective training, and even for medical staff and also the ordinary people as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kensuke. Yes, Suryan, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think two additional issues. One is that besides access to vaccine, I think vaccination program, how we can ensure distribution and really equip the country with the needed vaccination is in fact remain to be a difficulty area in many countries. despite they know the fact that vaccine will help, but how they can roll out massive vaccination has been an issue and raised by many countries. That's one. The other issues that now emerge as a concern in response to new strain is the efficacy of the vaccine itself that made our has been built based on the strain that we experienced last year. So this has raised concern, and therefore, if we can proactively look into vaccine production and distribution without trying to understand what it means in terms of coping strategy of new strain, this also complicates matters. I think these two remain to be an issue for the coming months, and I just raised this not as an answer, but as a point for consideration that vaccination might not be really a quick fix solution, but we need to look into it in a broader perspective. Back to you.
Thank you, Surian. Since we are over time now, I think we can conclude the Q&A session for this. And thank you to all our speakers. And back to you, Ronnie.
Okay, thank you, Sojun. And again, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful presentation, and also thank our participants for their lively discussions as well as active questions. So I guess in summary, what we can conclude by saying that the policy recommendations, as stated in the survey 2021, is very much in place, both at the regional as well as at the national level, given by the examples of the Mekong region and also in Indonesia. What is first and foremost of importance is the need to actually fast track this policy into actual realization to ensure that the COVID recovery is as planned and is enabled to address all the concerns as well as to those heavily impacted by the pandemic. So, of course, in support of these countries, regional as well as international organizations such as the UN and Mekong Institutes and OECD stand ready to support member states in their pursuit to a full recovery in the region as well as at the national level. So with that, again, I'd just like to thank everyone here, Dr. Suvojit, Ibu Diandra, Kun Suryan, as well as Kensuke-san for their time in attending this webinar for the Southeast Asia Policy Dialogue. So with that, I conclude our webinar. But before I leave, I would like to play a video. This is one of our video on the Survey 2021 report, and it highlights some of the features of the report. And again, all the presentations will be uploaded on our website in case you would like to relook them. And if you have any questions, do give us an email, and hopefully we can answer them. So again, thank you very much for your time and effort. Have a good day, everyone. Goodbye.